The candles in the Ashford ballroom were lit 3 deep along every wall the night Cecily Hartwell understood, with perfect clarity, that she was not worth a second glance from the most powerful man in the room. She had not meant to be near enough to hear it. She had been crossing the edge of the supper room, carrying a glass her brother Gerald had asked for and then forgotten, when 2 voices settled into the alcove just behind the silk-draped column at her left shoulder. She recognized Lady Dorothea Vane's voice at once, that measured contralto that carried even when it was pitched low, as if it had never learned the necessity of discretion. "Miss Hartwell has been proposed," the other voice said, a man's voice Cecily did not know. "The Hartwell connection is not without merit. Her mother's family held a seat in Wiltshire." A brief pause. Then Lady Dorothea, smooth as ice drawn over stone. "Christopher will not consider it. I did not trouble him with the particulars. He has not met her. There is no need. The Hartwells are £4,000 in debt and sinking. Gerald Hartwell will sell his sister to whoever holds the note. That is not a match. That is a transaction, and my son does not conduct transactions." A pause in which Cecily could hear the faint snap of a fan being closed. "He will not look at her. And she is not the sort of woman who commands a second look regardless." The glass in Cecily's hand was cold against her palm. She set it down on the nearest surface, a side table holding a vase of white hothouse flowers, and she walked out of the supper room with her spine perfectly straight and her face arranged as if she had heard nothing worth remembering. What she did not yet know was that the Duke of Ashford had, at that very moment, been standing 3 feet to the other side of the same column, waiting for a footman to bring his coat. He had heard every word his mother spoke. He had not corrected her. And what lived in him after that silence was a discomfort he would not name for 6 more weeks. The season had pressed itself upon Cecily with the particular weight of something that does not care whether it is welcome. She was 23 years old, which was considered late enough in the season's arithmetic to produce a faint collective sighing among the women who kept such accounts. Her father had died 14 months before the opening ball, leaving Gerald in possession of the Hartwell house in Somerset, and in possession also of £4,000 of accumulated debt, whose origin Cecily had pieced together from overheard conversations and Gerald's habit of leaving solicitors' letters face up on the dining table. The house could be saved, in theory. Cecily's marriage to someone with sufficient capital could discharge the debt and restore the property's standing. This was the calculation Gerald presented to her not unkindly in their rented rooms in Marylebone 2 days before the season opened. He did not ask her opinion of it. In the period's machinery, a woman with no independent income and a brother holding the lease on her lodging did not have an opinion that altered outcomes. She wore a gown of pale gray at the opening ball, retrimmed in fresh ivory ribbon because the original silver lace had pulled. It was neat. It was entirely correct. It did not compete with the diamonds and shot silk distributed across the room like evidence of a world that moved differently from hers. She danced twice, once with a baronet who spent both sets talking about his hunter, and once with a solicitor's son whom Gerald had invited deliberately. She drank 1 glass of wine and spent the remainder of the evening watching the room and thinking, with the dry precision she kept mostly to herself, that the season was a very expensive form of being told the same thing many times until one believed it. It was Gerald who arranged the companion's position at Ashford Park, and he arranged it with the cheerful confidence of a man who does not see the difference between a solution and a sentence. The Duke's ward, a child of 7 named Clara, required a companion of good family and steady temper while her formal lessons were organized. Lady Dorothea had been managing the child's household herself, which was, as Mrs. Paget's letter to Gerald's solicitor noted with careful neutrality, proving inadequate to the child's needs. The arrangement was not a governess's post, precisely. Cecily would dine with the family, accompany the child, and serve in the household's upper register. She would receive £30 for the season. She would leave London. Gerald called it a fortunate opening. Cecily packed her trunk in one afternoon and did not argue with him, because the alternative was remaining in the Marylebone Rooms, while Gerald negotiated on her behalf with men who regarded £4,000 as both a lever and an invitation. Ashford Park announced itself through the carriage window on an afternoon in early April as a long grey stone facade behind a gate of old iron, the grounds rolling away from it on three sides in a color somewhere between green and the memory of winter. It was neither welcoming nor forbidding. It was simply there, occupying its portion of the world with the solidity of something that has been certain of its own existence for several centuries and sees no reason to revise that certainty. Mrs. Paget met the carriage in the courtyard. She was a compact woman of perhaps 60, with a face that carried the particular economy of expression belonging to people who have spent long years in a house where expression was expensive. She looked at Cecily with a steadiness that was not unfriendly, took in the plain trunk and the neat grey coat, and said, "Miss Hartwell, Clara has been watching the drive since noon." Clara appeared at the top of the steps a moment later, 7 years old, and arranged with the self-conscious formality of a child who has been told too many times how to stand. She had her father's coloring, that same quality of stillness, dark-haired and precise in her movements. She looked at Cecily without the season's apparatus of appraisal, which is to say she looked without calculation, and what she found there apparently satisfied her, because she walked down 3 steps and said, "Mrs. Paget said you might read to me. Do you know any stories that are not improving?" Cecily considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Several," she said. Clara's face shifted into something that was not quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. She turned and went back up the steps, and Cecily followed her into Ashford Park. The Duke returned from London 4 days after Cecily's arrival, arriving on horseback rather than by carriage in the late afternoon, when the light was low and the courtyard stones held the day's last warmth. Cecily saw him from Clara's window, where she had been reading aloud while Clara drew at the table beside her. She marked the place in the book without comment and watched him dismount, pass the reins to a groom, and stand for a moment in the courtyard with his hand on the horse's neck and his gaze on the house's upper windows. He was taller than she had registered at the ball, and his face in profile had a quality she had not expected, not arrogance, but a held interior pressure, the look of a man who has governed himself for so long that the governance has become the visible surface. Clara had not moved from her drawing. She had not looked up. Cecily set the book down and said quietly, "Your guardian has arrived." "I know," said Clara, and continued drawing. Lady Dorothea found Cecily the following morning in the long corridor outside the schoolroom. She was dressed for riding, which she apparently intended as an expression of continued ownership of the house's rhythms, and she stopped with the deliberate precision of a woman who has always expected rooms to reorganize themselves around her. "Miss Hartwell," she said, making the name a small, precise dismissal. "I trust Mrs. Paget has made the household's requirements clear. Your role is the child. You are not required in the drawing-room in the evenings, unless I invite you." "I understand," Cecily said. "Clara has a tendency toward sentimentality that is not useful to her." Lady Dorothea's gaze moved briefly over Cecily's grey morning dress. "I would not encourage it. She is a duke's ward. She has a position to maintain." She walked on before Cecily could answer. Which was, Cecily reflected, the point. The first dismissive label arrived 3 days later in the form of a remark Lady Dorothea made to her companion, a Mrs. Cleeve, in the morning room as Cecily passed the open door. The door was open. The remark was not lowered. A reduced gentlewoman with serviceable manners. One does not expect more of companions. Cecily kept walking. She filed it where she filed most things she could not use, in the quiet back register of her mind, behind the things that mattered. Christopher crossed Cecily's immediate world gradually, in the manner of a tide rather than a wave. She would find him in the library at hours when she had assumed the room was unoccupied, seated at the large writing table with correspondence spread before him, looking up when she appeared with the calibrated alertness of a man who has been interrupted in thought rather than in absence. He would say, "Miss Hartwell," and she would say, "Your Grace," and one of them would find a reason to leave. On 2 occasions, he did not leave. He watched her take the book she had come for, and when she turned to go, he said, "Is Clara well today?" In the tone of a man asking about the weather, the sort of careful distance that could not be mistaken for warmth. "She drew for 2 hours this morning," Cecily said. The second time, "She has strong preferences about which colors are correct for which subjects." Something shifted in his expression. It was brief and largely invisible, the way a candle flame adjusts when someone opens a door in another room. "She does," he said, and returned to his correspondence. She did not know he stayed at the writing table for another half-hour without reading a word. The witnessing happened on an afternoon in the 3rd week of April, in the garden. Cecily was not aware that anyone was present in the upper terrace walk when Lady Dorothea found Clara seated on the low stone bench near the sundial, drawing again, this time with one of the miniature portraits she had taken from the house and set before her as a subject. The miniature was a small thing, painted on ivory in an oval frame of gilt wire, the likeness of a young woman with dark hair arranged simply, painted with the kind of care that is given to remembrance rather than decoration. It had been Clara's mother's portrait. Cecily knew this because Mrs. Paget had told her, one evening in the housekeeper's room over tea, in the careful way of someone offering information that the household requires someone else to hold. "Put that away," Lady Dorothea said to Clara, with a smooth flatness that had nothing of cruelty in it and everything of erasure. "It is not appropriate to carry that about the garden." Clara's hand closed around the frame but did not move. "Clara," the voice did not rise. "I will not ask again." Cecily stepped forward from the path. "Your Grace," she said, using the honorific with the precision of someone drawing a clear line in a room that has already become a courtroom. Clara was using the portrait as a drawing subject. It is an exercise in observation. I asked her to attempt it. It was not true. She had not asked Clara to do anything of the kind. She said it with perfect steadiness, looking directly at Lady Dorothea, her hands quiet at her sides. Lady Dorothea looked at her for a moment. "A companion corrects her charge, Miss Hartwell. She does not correct her employer." "I was not correcting you," Cecily said. "I was providing context." Lady Dorothea held the pause with the skill of a woman who has held many pauses and found them effective. Then she walked away along the terrace with measured steps, each one confirming her ownership of the stone beneath her feet. Clara looked up at Cecily. She still held the miniature. "You may keep drawing," Cecily said. She did not know that Christopher had come out through the library's garden door 4 minutes earlier and had stood at the terrace's upper end, pressed back against the ivy-covered wall, watching all of it. She did not know that he had watched her step forward, watched her speak the untruth with the calm of someone who has decided that the child's well-being is worth more than the convenience of accuracy. She did not know what it cost him to remain still. He came to find her that evening in the corridor outside the schoolroom. He had the quality of a man who has revised a decision 3 times on the way to delivering it. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "I owe you an acknowledgement." She looked at him with a wariness she did not bother to fully conceal. "Your Grace, what you did this afternoon was not required by your position. I am aware of that." Cecily said nothing. "Clara," he said, and then stopped. His jaw tightened very slightly, the way stone tightens when something runs under it. "Clara does not respond easily. She has not responded easily since her mother died. I have not always known what to do with that." It was the most he had said to her at once. She understood, from the effort behind it, that it was more than he said to most people. "She is learning to trust the house again," Cecily said. "It takes time." He looked at her directly, and for one moment his face had nothing held back from it, and she saw the tiredness there, and the grief, and the specific shape of a man who has been alone with something heavy for a very long time. "Yes," he said. "It does." He went back toward the library. She stood in the corridor for a moment with her hand resting on the schoolroom door, and felt the first stirring of something she was not yet prepared to name. If you have found yourself drawn into Cecily's world, you are welcome to leave a word in the comments before the story runs further. Those small signals keep stories like this one alive, and the next passage turns heavier before it turns warm. Mrs. Paget told Cecily about Eleanor on a rainy Thursday afternoon, when the schoolroom lesson was cancelled due to Clara's cold, and the house had settled into a quiet that felt contemplative rather than empty. They sat in the housekeeper's room, the older woman with her mending, and Cecily with her tea growing cold, and the account came not as disclosure, but as the natural layering of a long story that someone finally had occasion to finish telling. Eleanor Vane had been 21 years old when she died, 6 years before, in the night following Clara's birth. Christopher had been in Yorkshire on estate business, a visit that had been delayed twice already, and could not, in the way of such things, be delayed a third time. The message reached him 7 hours after Eleanor died. He had ridden through the night in weather that should have made riding impossible. He had arrived at Ashford Park in time to see Clara, who was 6 hours old, and who looked at him. "Mrs. Paget said quietly, with Eleanor's eyes. He had not grieved loudly. He had closed the door to his rooms for 2 days and come out afterward with the same face he had worn before, only quieter. And from that point forward he had run the estate, managed the duchy, fulfilled every obligation that his position demanded, and held himself at a distance from everything that required him to feel the full weight of a present moment, including Clara. "He loves her," Mrs. Paget said, her needle going through the cloth. "He does not know how to be near her. She is too much of Eleanor, and not enough of the wife he still remembers, and he does not know how to separate those truths." Cecily held her cooling tea and thought about a man who had learned to discipline himself against the very thing he loved, because being close to it hurt in a way that discipline could almost, but never entirely, hold at bay. The dismissive label came a second time in the presence of others, which was the point of it. The occasion was a small afternoon gathering Lady Dorothea organized in the drawing room. 3 local families invited for the purpose, as Cecily gradually understood, of introducing Miss Arabella Fenn into the house's social orbit, with the maximum of efficiency. Arabella was everything the season had prepared as its finest product. 20 years old, composed, wearing a gown of deep blue that cost more than Cecily's yearly income, with the practiced ease of a young woman who had been told since childhood that she was exactly correct. She was not unkind. She was simply already positioned. Lady Dorothea spoke of Clara's education across the tea service with the smooth fluency of an entirely different fact, glancing at Cecily once in the manner of someone acknowledging the presence of furniture. "Miss Hartwell manages the child's daily arrangements quite adequately," she said to Mrs. Alford, one of the local matrons. One cannot expect original judgment from a companion. One expects reliability. Mrs. Alford looked at Cecily with a brief, slightly apologetic kindness, the kind that acknowledges a wound it cannot prevent. Cecily smiled at her, a small, careful smile, and looked at her teacup. Christopher was in the room. He had not been expected, or Lady Dorothea had not expected him, which was visible in the slight rearrangement of her expression when he appeared in the doorway. He had come, apparently, looking for a document that had been left on the drawing-room desk, and he had been present for at least the last sentence of his mother's assessment. He sat down. He accepted tea. He spoke for 20 minutes about estate matters, with two of the assembled husbands with the exact level of social ease that requires no investment of the interior. He did not look at Arabella with the attention Lady Dorothea had arranged the room to produce. He looked, once, at Cecily, in a way she read as the polite acknowledgement of an employer toward an employee, which was all it could possibly mean, which was what she told herself when she felt the warmth of it moving up toward her face. The season at Ashford Park deepened into May. The ground shifted from the formal green of early spring into the layered, particular green of a countryside, confident in its own growth. Cecily walked with Clara each morning before lessons, along the lower garden path, and sometimes as far as the small gate at the meadow's edge. Clara had begun to talk more freely on these walks, in the sideways manner of a child who is testing the durability of a presence before committing to trust. She spoke mostly about what she was drawing, about which colors she could not get right, about a cat that had appeared in the kitchen garden and had not yet been officially acknowledged by anyone in authority. "Mrs. Paget says it is not our cat," Clara said one morning. "What do you say?" Cecily asked. Clara considered the meadow. "I say it was here first." It was on one of these walks that Christopher appeared on the path behind them, having come from the direction of the stables. He fell into step at Cecily's side without announcement or ceremony, in the way of a man who has thought about doing something for long enough that the decision to actually do it feels overdue. Clara walked ahead, apparently indifferent, though Cecily noticed the slight straightening of the child's spine. "She is drawing better," he said. "She is drawing more," Cecily said. "The better will follow." He was quiet for a moment. The path curved, and the morning light came through the lime trees at an angle that found the worn edge of his coat's left cuff, a detail Cecily noticed, and then did not look at again. "I looked at her drawings last week," he said. I had not done that before. She had left a portfolio on the library table. "She leaves things where she hopes they will be found," Cecily said. "I believe it is a form of conversation." He said nothing for several paces. Then quietly, "I should have understood that earlier." She did not answer, because there was nothing in his voice that required an answer. It had not been said to her. It had been said to the path, and to the lime trees, and perhaps to the morning itself. And she was simply present enough to hear it. Clara had stopped at the meadow gate and was looking back at them with an expression Cecily could not fully read, something between satisfaction and the careful hope of a child who has arranged a situation and is waiting to see whether the arrangement holds. It held. That morning, and across the afternoons that followed, it held. Lady Dorothea escalated in the manner of a woman who recognizes that the ground has shifted without being able to name the force that moved it. Her method was social, because social was the only lever she had fully mastered. She wrote to Arabella's family and arranged an extended visit, a full week at Ashford Park beginning the second Friday of May. She organized a formal dinner for the following Saturday, 30 guests from the county's better households, seating arranged with the precision of a general disposing troops. Cecily was not, of course, placed near Christopher. She was placed at the far end of the table's right wing, between Mr. Alfred and a Viscount's younger son who spoke at length about his recent trip to Edinburgh and paused only to eat. Arabella was placed at Christopher's left, her blue gown exchanged for one of deep green with seed pearls at the collar, her profile turned toward him at the angle most advantageous for candlelight. Lady Dorothea sat at the table's head with the quiet assurance of a woman watching a mechanism she has constructed operating precisely as designed. Cecily ate her dinner and spoke sensibly with Mr. Alfred about the spring planting, and felt the evening's meaning pressing on her with the weight of a door being gently but firmly closed. She had known the position. She had always known it. A reduced gentlewoman with serviceable manners did not sit near dukes at formal dinners unless the duke chose to put her there, and Christopher had not chosen. He had not arranged the seating. His mother had arranged the seating. This was a distinction that Cecily kept making in her interior with the persistence of someone who is trying to believe something for which the evidence is thin. Across the table, 15 feet and a regiment of crystal and silver away, Christopher spoke with his dinner guests with the measured courtesy that was his social surface. He did not look at Arabella with what anyone would call preference. He did not look at Cecily at all, which was its own answer, or she told herself it was. Lady Dorothea made her final remark as the ladies withdrew in the drawing-room while the tea service was being arranged. She said it to Mrs. Alfred, but pitched it at the room, which held 5 other women, including Arabella, and including Cecily. One does hope Clara's companion understands her situation clearly. Miss Hartwell is a sensible creature in her way. But companions who mistake civility for welcome tend to become uncomfortable in houses where the hierarchy is well understood. 3 women found reasons to look elsewhere. Mrs. Alfred looked at the floor. Arabella looked at Cecily with what appeared to be genuine discomfort, quickly suppressed. Cecily looked at Lady Dorothea directly, her expression composed, and said nothing. She returned to her rooms that night and sat for a long time in the chair beside the window, where the May dark outside was dense with the smell of the garden. She had come here under constraint. She had stayed because Clara needed steadiness, and because the position paid, and because there had been, for a few weeks, something in the house's rhythm that had felt close to belonging. She had allowed herself to feel that. It was her own error, and she was accustomed to absorbing errors with whatever dignity she could arrange. She would not leave in the night. She would not give the appearance of flight. She would write to Gerald in the morning, explain that the arrangement had concluded, and she would leave Ashford Park on Friday with her trunk and her £30 and her dignity intact, which was more than she had arrived with in certain respects and about even in others. She began the letter in her mind, working through the formal opening, and it was in this methodical interior rehearsal that she remembered the miniature. Clara had hidden it 3 days ago, at Cecily's suggestion, inside the cover of the drawing portfolio, after Lady Dorothea had twice attempted to remove it from the schoolroom. Cecily had told Clara she would keep it safe. She had not thought carefully enough about what keeping it safe required. She sat with this for a moment. The miniature was a portrait of Eleanor. It belonged, by every measure of moral weight that Cecily was capable of applying, to Christopher. Not to Clara's portfolio, not to Cecily's safekeeping, and not to the threat of Lady Dorothea's housekeeping reach. It belonged to the man who had ridden through a Yorkshire night in weather that should have stopped him, and arrived too late, and had been living with that lateness for 6 years. She rose from the chair. She found him in the library, as she had consistently found him in the library at hours when the house was otherwise settled. He was at the writing table with a single candle burning and a letter before him that he was not reading. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and something in his face opened before he could prevent it. a brief, unguarded quality that he recovered almost immediately. "Miss Hartwell," he said, rising. "Forgive the hour," she said. She crossed the room and set the miniature on the writing table in front of him. "Clara had it in safekeeping. It should be yours." He looked at the miniature. He did not touch it immediately. The candlelight found the gilt frame and held there. "I knew she had taken it," he said after a silence. "I was not sure what to do about that." "She uses it as a drawing subject," Cecily said. "She is trying to know her mother through it. It is the only form of knowing available to her." His hand moved to the miniature and rested beside it without quite taking it up. "I should have given it to her," he said, "instead of leaving it on the mantel for her to take." "Yes," Cecily said. She said it without softening it, because that was the sort of honesty she had left to offer him, and because softening it would have been a form of condescension. His gaze came up from the miniature and found her face. In the candlelight, stripped of the dinner's social machinery and the house's formal daylight, he looked at her the way she had not permitted herself to hope he would look at her, which is to say directly, and for a full sustained moment, without looking away. "You are leaving," he said. It was not a question. She had not told anyone. "On Friday," she said. "My mother," he said, and stopped. "Your mother is protecting what she understands," Cecily said. "I cannot fault her for that. I am not what she would choose for this house. That is a reasonable position on her part." "It is not her position to hold," he said. The quiet authority in it was different from his social authority. This had the quality of something decided rather than performed. She looked at him for one more moment, because she was going to leave on Friday, and she understood that this was the last time the library would be warm with candlelight and the two of them in it, and no correct conclusion to draw about what that meant. Then she said, "Good night, Your Grace," and went to the door. "Miss Hartwell." She stopped. "Cecily." Her first name in his voice had the weight of something being set down after a long carrying. She stood with her hand on the door frame and waited for whatever came next. "Stay," he said. It was one syllable, offered without decoration, which was the truest form of what he knew how to give. She stood for a moment in the doorframe with the halls dark at her back and the candles gold before her. And then she turned and faced him, and the night continued around them. The formal dinner's reversal came the following evening. Christopher had sent no warning, no indication to any member of the household that the evening's arranged social program was about to be interrupted. Lady Dorothea had organized a small recital in the drawing room, 10 of the 30 dinner guests returning for the occasion, with Arabella at the piano and the gathered company arranged as audience. Mrs. Paget had deployed the footmen with the usual precision. Cecily had been present only at Clara's insistence, the child having refused her supper until Cecily agreed to accompany her to the drawing-room's doorway, where she could observe without being technically included. 30 people in the drawing-room. The candles burning in the girandels on the east wall, Arabella's playing a competent and entirely correct rendering of a Haydn sonata. Lady Dorothea sat near the fireplace with the settled confidence of a woman watching a plan arrive at its intended station. Christopher crossed the drawing-room floor from the doors at the far end. He did not move quickly. He moved with the measured deliberateness of a man who has made the most important decision of the last 6 years and sees no particular reason to hurry it now that it is made. The room's conversation lost its thread in increments as he crossed, 20 people, then 15, noticing the direction of his movement. Arabella's playing faltered at the end of the phrase, and then stopped. He stopped in front of Cecily. She was standing in the doorway with Clara's hand in hers, wearing the plain gray gown she had worn the first evening at Ashford Park, and the girandole's light fell on her from behind Christopher's shoulder, and the drawing room's 30 witnesses were very quiet. "Miss Hartwell," he said, and then with the deliberate specificity of a man using a first name as a declaration. "Cecily, will you come in?" It was not a question any more than his previous one-word request had been a question. It had the quality of an invitation and the weight of a public commitment, offered in front of the county's assembled opinion with the full knowledge of what that weight meant. Lady Dorothea's fan, which she had been holding at the measured height of a woman in complete command of her surroundings, lowered by several inches. She understood in this moment precisely what was happening and what it cost her to absorb it. Cecily looked at Christopher's face. She read there the same quality she had seen in the library: the decision made, the cost acknowledged, the mask not set aside but voluntarily surrendered. She felt the press of 30 gazes on the back of her neck and the sound of Arabella's sonata not resuming and the solid warmth of Clara's hand in hers. "Your Grace," she said, and walked forward into the room. He took a step to meet her, which placed him at her side in a way the assembled company could only read one way, and said in a voice that was quiet, but carried in the drawing-room's held silence, "Gerald Hartwell's debt of £4,000 will be settled through my solicitor before Friday. You will not need to return to London." A pause. "If you prefer to remain here." It was the most specific declaration available to a man of his reserve, and the most costly, and every person in the room with any knowledge of the Duchy's affairs understood it. Lady Dorothea rose from her chair. For one instant she looked at her son with the expression of a woman recalibrating everything she had believed was certain, and Cecily saw in that expression not only the confidence collapsing, but something beneath it, a genuine and surprised recognition that she had mistaken the measure of the situation she had been managing. Then she looked at Cecily, and her expression was not warm, but it was honest, which was more than Cecily had expected. "Miss Hartwell," Lady Dorothea said, in a voice that had lost its cutting edge and was only its own weight, "is apparently not what I supposed." She did not apologize. Apology was too much to ask of a woman whose entire architecture was organized around certainty. But she sat down again and she turned her gaze to the middle distance, and she did not speak for the remainder of the evening, which was its own form of acknowledgement. Arabella closed the piano's lid quietly, without drama, with the composed grace of a young woman who has understood, as she watched Christopher cross the room, that the script she had been handed belonged to a story being told about someone else. She accepted a glass of wine from a footman and found a seat beside Mrs. Alford and spoke, a little while later, about the quality of the spring weather, and managed it without any visible distress that was not her own private business. Gerald was present, having arrived at Ashford Park that afternoon on the strength of Lady Dorothea's invitation, and he stood at the room's far edge with the expression of a man who has been entirely outmaneuvered by a sequence of events he did not organize and cannot object to without forfeiting his own interests. He did not speak. He nodded once in Cecily's direction, which was as close as Gerald could come, under such circumstances, to Grace. Mrs. Paget had appeared in the doorway behind Clara when Christopher crossed the room, drawn there by some long-cultivated sense of the house's hinge moments, and she stood with her hands folded and her face doing nothing that could be called public emotion, which in Mrs. Paget was a form of intense feeling. When Cecily glanced back at her, the housekeeper gave a single small nod of her head, the kind that means this is what was wanted, and turned back toward the corridor. The evening found its equilibrium again in the way that evenings are very good at finding. People redistributed into smaller conversations, the girandoles continuing their warm business. The Haydn sonata eventually resumed by a young woman from the Alford family who played with rather more enthusiasm than precision. Cecily sat near Clara on a small settee and let the room's warmth settle around her, and did not speak much, because the speaking had been done, and the remainder was simply the quiet understanding that the world, or this small portion of it, had arranged itself differently than it had been arranged before. Christopher sat nearby, not at her side in any proclamatory fashion, simply present in the room's same portion as she was, which was the most ordinary and the most changed thing. Clara, beside Cecily, held the ivory miniature in her hands, which Christopher had pressed into his ward's keeping before he crossed the drawing-room floor. She looked at it for a long while and then looked at Cecily and said nothing, because at 7 years old she understood that some moments are larger than what words are built for. The snow came in November, which was early by the valley's usual reckoning. Cecily woke to it on a Thursday morning to find the grounds below the bedroom window covered to an even quietness, the lime trees holding white along their upper branches, the kitchen garden's low walls softened into shapes that were no longer walls, but suggestions of walls. The room itself was warm, which was an entirely different kind of fact than it had been in the Marylebone rooms, where warmth was rationed, and even different from the early weeks at Ashford Park, when warm rooms had been her employer's provision. This warmth was hers in a way she was still learning to inhabit, the way one learns to inhabit any home that has been genuinely offered. She dressed and went downstairs to find Clara already in the drawing room with her portfolio open and her pencils arranged in the order of her personal taxonomy, attempting to draw the snow in the garden through the tall window. She had placed the miniature of Eleanor on the drawing room's mantel herself, 2 weeks before, having asked Christopher's permission with the formal seriousness she applied to things that mattered. He had agreed, and the miniature had been there since, in the warm company of the firelight. Cecily stood in the doorway for a moment and watched Clara draw, and listened to the house around her. Mrs. Paget's step in the corridor behind her, the distant sound of the kitchen hearth being built up for the morning, the particular hush of a house in first snow. Christopher appeared at the drawing-room's far door. He had been riding in the early hours before the snow settled, which meant he had come in through the courtyard, and he still had the cold of the outside clinging to his coat. He stopped when he saw her in the doorway, in the manner of a man who has not yet stopped finding the fact of her they're worth stopping for, and for a moment the three of them were simply a configuration in a warm room with snow outside and a fire building and Clara's pencil making its small sounds across the paper. He looked at Cecily across the room, and she looked back at him, and there was no held reserve in it anymore. There was only the direct and uncostly acknowledgement of two people who have found each other past the considerable machinery designed to prevent that finding. On the mantel above the fire, in the small gilt oval frame, Eleanor's portrait received the morning's first light. Clara turned from the window, assessed her drawing, and said, with the judicial authority she deployed for such assessments, "I cannot get the white right. White is the hardest color." "It is," Cecily agreed. "Mrs. Paget says it is because white is not one color, but all of them at once." Christopher crossed the room and sat beside his ward and looked at her drawing with the full attention of a man who is no longer governing himself against that proximity, and Clara, who had been waiting, in her sidelong 7-year-old way, for precisely this, leaned against his arm without ceremony and continued drawing. Cecily watched them from the doorway. The snow went on falling outside the tall windows. The fire in the drawing-room grate took hold fully, and the room's warmth deepened, and the morning at Ashford Park began in the manner of mornings that have learned, at last, to be at peace with themselves. The miniature held its quiet place on the mantel, and no one that morning felt the need to put it away. If Cecily's journey has stayed with you, leave a word in the comments below. Stories of quiet women who deserved to be seen are always worth telling, and your presence here is what keeps them alive.